Have you ever stopped to question whether or not you are actually allergic to your food? And not allergic in a way that's like the profound, life-threatening anaphylaxis, but just low-grade allergies that instead of making you overtly sick, you just get a little bit sicker with each meal that you eat. That was the question of my first guest today. Robyn O'Brien is the co-founder of Replant Capital. She had a 20-year career in food and finance and then became the Erin Brockovich of the food industry. She is here to spread the message that there actually is good, clean food that consumers want to eat, but for some reason, it's not being offered to us. After I talk with Robyn, I am going to talk to you a little bit more about the environmental impact that you can have in your daily life simply by eating more plants. After that, I'll share a few blog posts that I have that will set you up for success to do a completely plant-based 4th of July. Welcome to the Lindsey Elmore Show, a podcast that helps you find fulfillment amidst chaos. On this show, I interview thought leaders, doctors, creatives, spiritual gurus, and game changers who inspire you to pursue your dreams, overcome obstacles, and leave your mark. The food system is broken, and we are sick because of it. Currently, up to 92% of United States corn is genetically engineered, as are 94% of soybeans and 94% of cotton. Cottonseed oil is commonly used in food products, so even this is not immune from getting into our food system. It has been estimated that upwards of 75% of processed foods on supermarket shelves, everything from soda to soup, crackers to condiments, contain genetically engineered ingredients. Most genetic modification in food is to make the crops resistant to herbicides, and that means that you can pour more toxins onto crops. This puts farmers, consumers, and most importantly, our precious land at risk. Even more shocking is the introduction of genetic modification into animals. These days, there are super pigs that contain human growth genes, fish that have cattle growth genes. What about tomatoes with flounder genes? Corn with bacteria genes, and animals and insect genes. At an alarming rate, all of these laboratory creations are being patented and released into our environment and into our food supply system. Companies are also not consistently providing consumers with the same products in foreign countries. Food is consistently cleaner in Europe than in the United States, despite being manufactured by US-based companies. We've also seen an explosion in food allergies over the past 20 years. According to the CDC, food allergies have increased 50% since 1997. 32 million people in the United States have a food allergy, including 1 in 10 adults, and some estimates say that 1 in 3 children have some kind of food allergy. 200,000 people every year in the United States require emergency care for severe food allergies that can be life-threatening. Caring for children with food allergies costs the average Americans $25 billion every single year. Big Pharma has their hand in the game too, and they have crafted a multi-billion-dollar industry around life-saving EpiPens and have gouged the price, putting the average American at risk. We ignore the fact that we have known class 1 carcinogens in common foods such as deli meats, and that there are many food-based illnesses such as diabetes, hypertension, and cardiovascular disease that can be prevented and oftentimes treated by choosing the correct food. Instead, we're driving billions of dollars into privatized healthcare and prescription drug costs. Basically, we have a food system that is strategically designed to keep us fat, sick, and nearly dead. And it's time to start looking at what is going wrong. Robyn O'Brien is a visionary voice in the food industry. She is the co-founder of Replant Capital, the author of The Unhealthy Truth, and she advises multinational food companies, nonprofits, startups, and governments around the world. Her work has been recognized by Prince Charles, Ted Turner, CEOs across the food industry and in the media, from Forbes to Fox News to the Today Show, Runner's World, and CNN. Robyn was a founding team member of AIM Invesco's first hedge fund of more than $100 million and a team member on their $20 billion Constellation Fund. She is an advisor to Paul Hawken's Drawdown and has advised startups, banks, governments, and multinationals while working with global CEOs and management teams in the food industry. Robyn is also the founder of Do Good, a strategic advisory firm, and Allergy Kids Foundation, which serves the 1 in 3 children with allergies, asthma, ADHD, and autism. Random House published Robyn's book, The Unhealthy Truth, in 2009, and her TEDx talk has been viewed by millions of people and translated into multiple languages. Robyn is from Texas, attended Washington and Lee in Virginia, where she graduated summa cum laude, and went on to pursue the prestigious Fulbright Fellowship in Paris, France, before earning her MBA from Rice University on a full scholarship. She is an adjunct professor at Rice University's Business School and is a married mother of 4. Robyn, I could not be more excited to talk to you. Welcome to the Lindsey Elmore Show.
Well, thanks so much for having me today.
I am fascinated by your story. And so let's just start. What, in your opinion, is broken with our food system?
You know, my career started in investments and finance, and I think it's a financial system. You know, how we allocate capital really impacts our health. And we're seeing that play out in real time right now during this COVID crisis. Where we have bottlenecks in the food system, where we have infrastructure failing in the food system is where there is a crisis. Farmers are producing plenty. That hasn't stopped. Consumers are still eating. That hasn't stopped. It's that infrastructure in the middle that's broken, and that's been financed by groups that have very narrow perspectives and understandings of sort of the scope of the problem. So when you think about it, to me, capital is the most important ingredient in the food system, and it's time that we start paying attention to that.
Okay, so where did your passion about this subject come from? How did you get involved in this, and how did you go from being a hedge fund manager to being a pioneer and a warrior on behalf of food safety?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely, this was not the story that I would have written for myself or that I would have thought I would be telling. And so, you know, that's been a big part of the lesson, is that life's going to deliver what you need, whether you're asking for it or not. And it's been an incredible challenge, but also an incredible blessing. And there's been so much opportunity in it as well. But, you know, I grew up not questioning the system in any way. I grew up in Houston. I went to business school on a full scholarship, and I went into investments. And as the only woman on the team, the guys had me cover the food industry, which, you know, at the time was kind of funny because I just wasn't a foodie. And I just was purely analytical. There was no passion involved. My heart wasn't involved. And quite honestly, it was easier that way. It was just, you know, simply analyzing these different spreadsheets and meeting with different management teams. And then 20 years ago, after the birth of our first child, we moved to Colorado. And so I hit pause on the investment career, fully intending to go back into it. And we had 4 kids. And when our 4th child was about a year old, she had an allergic reaction. So all of a sudden, you know, the food industry that I had not been emotionally involved in I'm wondering how it's made my child so sick and what a child is supposed to do if she is allergic to food. And as I was looking at the data on food allergies, it's pretty jaw-dropping how many kids in the US now have food allergies. EpiPen's a $1 billion brand. It's 2 kids in every classroom. And from 1997 until 2007, there was a 265% increase in hospitalizations related to food allergic reactions. So that's people getting checked into the ER. That's not somebody saying, oh, I'm lactose intolerant or I'm gluten sensitive. Like, these are people checked into the ER, and there was a 265% increase in a 10-year period. So I'm like, what has changed? What has changed? Mm-hmm. And as I began kind of digging back into my work as an analyst, I realized that we had fundamentally shifted the way we produce food in this country. And we had introduced a lot of new ingredients into our food supply, and they were unlabeled, as those same ingredients were introduced in other countries, things like genetically engineered ingredients. They were labeled, in all of our key trading partners, and they hadn't been here. And so, I was raised by a dad who was in the U.S. Army. And so the patriot in me kind of went off. And I thought, like, this is incredibly unpatriotic. It's incredibly uninformed. And for us to not have the freedom of choice when it comes to our food system and what we're choosing to put into our own bodies and feeding our families, that felt so un-American to me. And I felt really compelled to begin to speak out on that. It wasn't easy in the beginning. The people that were speaking out on it, they used a lot of fear. And I, as a mother of 4, I thought, like, I can't hear that. Fear makes me shut down and want to turn you off. So how can we talk about these changes in a way that make people realize that the reason you feel those things like fear, anger, sadness, and grief is because you love, you love your country and you love your kids. And so I studied the way different people communicate to try to better understand how I could take something that's pretty scary and communicate it in a much more positive way. And really sort of say, this has happened. It was an enormous challenge, and it took a lot of time to really kind of think through and analyze the way that I would present that. But I'm really lucky to have had phenomenal teachers all the way through my life. And I had phenomenal friends, kind of come around me at that really critical time. And I began to speak on the issue. And it was fascinating, because when you can kind of show a side-by-side analysis of 2 Kellogg's products, and the one that's being sold here in the US is full of a bunch of artificial crap, and the one that's being sold in Europe is full of real ingredients, like, that tells its own story. That's a double standard that's been imposed on our families by our own American food companies. And people have a universal response to that. And so, in a way, it's just, you let the data tell the story and people respond.
So, as you mentioned, this is not easy. You're talking about a massive system here that is massively funded, as you mentioned. So you're taking on this wheel of big food, big agra, and I will add big pharma, because it's all one big cycle, and big money. And it's a system that you want to see broken. But how do you find the courage to do that when you're up against some powerful adversaries who could bankrupt you just with one court case and drag it out and ruin your life? I mean, how do you find the courage to show up and speak out again and again and again?
I didn't have that courage at first. And I can remember sitting in that space for probably 6 to 9 months. And I would look at the kids playing in the yard, or we'd be at a park, and I'd look at the kids, other kids playing. And I thought, like, there is a double standard that's been imposed on American families that is so incredibly wrong and so unjust. And it became something that knowledge in me felt toxic, that if I didn't at least try, I knew that it would become toxic. And you can't know something like that and have seen it in the financial statements and in the structures and be able to show, through that data and analytics, that this has indeed happened. I mean, there's side-by-side comparisons of this double standard. So it wasn't like it was anything hypothetical, I mean, Kellogg's in their own earnings statement are going to tell you, we use genetically engineered ingredients over here. And guess what? In Europe, we're not doing that because there's sort of more legislative issues. So the companies were speaking for themselves. So again, it was just really sort of pulling the curtain back on the double standard that was already in place. There really were some really dark nights, and there was a lot of fear and a lot of anguish and a lot of sadness and a lot of grief. And I realized that I felt all of those things because I loved. And once I kind of realized that love is actually the thing that we have in abundance, that is actually the rocket fuel that can inspire us to be braver than we ever thought to be. So that's what I really learned to tap into. But I also knew I couldn't do it alone. And so I really did a lot of research and reached out to a lot of different people, scientists. There were doctors who had tried to question, sort of the integrity of the food supply, and they had been silenced. And I realized that there were actually a lot of us who were coming to this from these very different backgrounds, and we came together as a really powerful coalition and team. There were other mothers who had started organizations, after they had lost a child. There's one in particular, her name was Colette, the daughter, and she died at 5. And the mother became an advocate on environmental toxins and pesticides. And so, again, like, nobody wants to step into this. Nobody wants to say, I want to be the face of this movement and risk everything that I am for it. But again, the food industry was the American food companies were the ones that created this double standard. And so it really was less about me and more just about exposing that double standard. What was fascinating was that, in the beginning, I was met with a lot of hate and vitriol and resentment, and it was really aggressive. The online trolling, the bullying was really aggressive. And, again, I sort of had to step back and say, this really isn't about me. And am I strong enough to handle this? Thankfully, I was raised by 2 very strong parents, and my family came around me at that time and, was sort of able to navigate those early years. But then what was fascinating is that I was able to stand in that ring and stand in that fire. CEOs of the multinational food companies started to reach out because they were parents too. And there was one who was the CEO of Nestle's frozen food division. And he said, you can say things I can't say. I need you to get in here and come in and meet with us and speak with our employees. And so that began, this fundamental change. Mm-hmm. And I joked that I was sort of like snuck in the back door of these companies at first. It didn't really matter. What I was so grateful for were those open minds and open hearts and people that were recognizing that we could actually build something better together.
So cast a vision for us. You said that you think that capital and the allocation of resources is at the heart of what is broken with our food system. So if you were in charge, and what would you want to see if you came to the end of your life and on your deathbed, you could see changes that were part of what you did in your life's work? How would you change the food system on a macro scale? Like, take us to the senior level of this discussion.
Yeah, that's a great question. Again, I really think capital allocation defines any industry. And when you look at the Farm Bill, the few crops, the 5 crops that we choose to subsidize through that Farm Bill don't represent nutrient diversity that a human needs. And so when you look at, the commoditization of corn and the commoditization of soy and the way those operating systems were created by Monsanto to basically sell more Roundup and sell more weed killer and sell more fungicide. It's a brilliant business model if you're selling chemicals, because you genetically engineer the seed so that it withstands more chemicals. And guess what? Revenue lines go up, and all of a sudden you've got licensing fees and trait fees and royalty fees. And I got to hand it to them. If I was on the board of Monsanto, that would have been a brilliant business model. Those shareholders were totally psyched. What happened was the consumer wasn't told that was happening. And so when you can pull those charts from the USDA, and again, the conservative roots that I have, like, I was sourcing conservative sources, and the USDA itself is telling us there's this massive uptick in the application of glyphosate, which now, Bayer is dealing with multiple lawsuits around the world because of the concern around it causing cancer. When the USDA is telling us, yes, indeed, here's the uptick. Once we introduce genetically engineered crops, again, it's like, there it is in plain sight. This is in plain sight. And I think so much of it is how our tax dollars are spent. And so, as people, again, like the way the government is spending money, and it doesn't matter if it's under a Democrat or a Republican, because I've been doing this for long enough, that both parties are doing the exact same thing. So this is a apolitical use of capital that's subsidizing certain systems. And unfortunately, so much of those tax dollars that go into this government pot are then used to subsidize systems, unfortunately, that make us sick. And, again, I had to sort of step back and also sort of let go of some certain beliefs that I had been raised with and say, okay, if we've got a for-profit medical system, sickness actually sells. So there's no incentive to try to keep people healthy. If you go to Europe, for example, in a universal healthcare system, they can't afford to be as sick as we are because it's not privatized, because it's not private companies that are profiting. Their taxpayers would deal with the burden of disease. But here we've privatized it. So because it's not public, we don't deal with it as taxpayers in the same way. Instead, our tax dollars are used to make cheap food. And so I thought about it. I thought, like if I had a choice, or you had a choice when we were sending in these tax dollars, how do we want that to be allocated? Do we want that to go towards genetically engineered corn and soy that is using increasing doses of Roundup? Or do we want tax dollars to make organic food more affordable? And then, even in the conversations with the farmers, they said, when we get these subsidies handed to us, it skews our incentives, and it would actually be better for us not to have subsidies. And again, subsidies just completely warp the economics of an industry. And so, now we have farmers that are 20 years into this genetically engineered operating system and that whole experiment, and they're realizing that their soil is sick. And it's no surprise, because after 20 years of chemical applications, the nutrient content of the soil has been damaged. And so farmers themselves are saying, what is regenerative agriculture? Well, regenerative agriculture is building soil health. And guess what? If I'm a farmer in Indiana farming 7,000 acres and I shift to regenerative agriculture, I'm not going to spend $500,000 on chemical inputs. So that's actually in the best interest of the farmer. What is fascinating right now under this COVID thing is that the farmer is realizing this in real time, because they're all of a sudden aware that by being told to focus on yield, which was absolutely the marketing message of the companies like Monsanto, it's just yield, 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 yield. You buy our seeds, you use our chemicals, yield. They realize that they've completely suffered in terms of profitability. And so now all of a sudden young people don't want to step into farming because there's $426 billion of debt that farmers carry in the US, and farm income is somewhere around negative $1,500. So it's like, what 30-year-old wants to step into that business model where they're going to be in debt forever and have a negative farm income? It's insane that any business would run without a profit and expect to stay in business. Yet that's exactly what we've asked our farmers to do. So thankfully, the silver lining in this crisis is the farmers waking up and saying, wait, why were we told to focus on yield when we should have been focusing on profitability? So how can the farmer focus on profitability? Spend less on chemical inputs, build soil health. And what's awesome about that is that's putting the control and empowering the farmer again at the local level. It's building soil health, which is good for the products coming off the farm, and then that's actually good for the consumer.
And I think it's also ironic. I remember when I watched the documentary King Corn, where two average Joes just go, they buy an acre of land in Iowa and they try to farm it according to Monsanto's principles. And one of the most profound statements in that documentary was the irony, the fact that we have Iowa farmers, the greatest corn producer in the United States, and they can't feed themselves. They cannot feed their own family because all of this genetically modified corn, it's inedible out of the field. It doesn't have any flavor. It doesn't have any taste. And talk to us a little bit. Another thing that is gravely concerning to me is the lack of diversity in our crops that has been very strategically manufactured over the course of the past, you tell me, 20, 50 years. Because with the lack of crop diversity, our crops can't thrive. And so talk to us about the value of heritage seeds and why that helps us to produce better food that makes us healthier.
Yeah, I think the lack of biodiversity in the field and the lack of diversity in farming are sort of two sides of the same coin. Began in the 1920s when land rights were stripped away from farmers of color. And you're from the South, I'm from the South. It's like we've seen that heritage and it is ugly and there are scars. And today only 0.53% of US farmland is farmed by Black farmers. So we've lost that heritage and we've lost that wisdom and we've lost that expertise. 95% of farm managers today are white. So, again, we've just consolidated it into one way of thinking. So it's really not surprising that we're in this crisis that we're in because we haven't tapped the resources that are available to us from this collective heritage of farming, from farmers of color and Native Americans. There's so much wisdom that's there. And it's not an either or situation. We're talking about both and. And unfortunately, you marry that, the homogenization of farming in America with the allocation of capital to just 5 crops. And all of a sudden, we don't have food security. When you have subsidized 5 crops at the expense of others, that is not food security. And, the Republican piece of me, the understanding that I had for it as a child raised in Texas was, food security is national security. And I'm realizing right now we don't have that. And it's interesting because I was just on a call earlier today with a policymaker at Driscoll's, and he had spent several years working in DC under different administrations on food and farm policy. And, he said that was very sort of Midwest focused. And now he's back in California and he's dealing with all the produce. And again, it's not an either or situation. We need both, but unfortunately capital allocation doesn't reflect that.
So make this simple for us. What can I do? What can just the average person do on a daily basis to help fix what is so profoundly broken?
That's a great question. And I think one of the most important things people need to do is believe in their ability to create change and really believe that you matter. I think not only have the farmers been disempowered, but consumers have been disempowered too. And we actually hold a lot of power together collectively. I mean, we're seeing it right now. Like the skies are clearing over LA, the canals in Venice are clear. Like that's our collective power. And so it's being modeled to us in real time, what we can do collectively. We can do that same thing in the food system. And we're seeing that because what's crazy is that 80% of households are buying or trying something organic. Not saying they're 100% organic, but there's something in your fridge that is organic. 80% of us are trying it. 75% of all grocery store categories now carry something organic. Only 1% of US farmland is organic, and that is insane. I mean, in no other industry would you have that huge discrepancy between what the consumer is asking for and what's being provided. And that discrepancy is being held in place by those government subsidies. So it's insane that the government is subsidizing a food system that we don't want anymore. At the same time, the consumer is demanding it in the marketplace. And so there's real opportunity. We're starting to sort of see it localized at the regional level. We're all getting to know farmers through our local farmers markets. We're learning to meet with local farmers or source from local farmers, or you hear it in farm to table at your local restaurants who are sourcing from local farmers. So getting to know your farmer, even at the farmers market, is a great first step, and also learning how to grow something. That felt really intimidating to me when I first started. And I just, one of the kids came home with a lima bean in a cup, and I was like, oh, okay, like it is that simple. Like you don't need to make it more complicated than it is. Pick some herbs or pick something super simple that you can start with and plan on failing, because then if you don't fail, you're going to be really psyched. But if you plan on failing, you just know to calculate that in and learn from those lessons and try again. And then, the last thing I would say is there are some amazing films. You mentioned King Corn, The Future of Food, Food Inc. There are amazing books out there now, whether it's, recipes and learning how to cook, or more learning about the food system. And, Michael Pollan's been in front of it for so long. My friend Bettina Siegel, she's got books on it. My book, The Unhealthy Truth. So they're book clubs. And I think invite people in, because chances are people are concerned, and maybe they're not sharing it publicly. Maybe they're just kind of concerned at home, or they're dealing with something in the health of a child, or maybe a family member has cancer and they're asking. Chances are people you love are thinking about it. It reminds me, I gave a talk in Houston, and an MD Anderson doctor said he called it the doorknob syndrome, where a patient's been diagnosed with cancer, has his hand on the doorknob to leave, and turns back in and says, what can I do with my diet? So he's like, we got to upstream the doorknob syndrome.
And yes, it is astonishing to me, especially right now amidst this coronavirus pandemic, that so many people are like, oh, it's just silly to think that you should be taking vitamin C and taking vitamin D, and maybe you're deficient in zinc or selenium, all these things. And I'm like, why would we not try that? There was this huge rush to like, what's the drug that we can use to treat? And we were using patients as guinea pigs and just being like, I don't know, try this drug, try that drug, try this thing. And I'm like, why would we not try to improve nutrition in our hospitals? Because I mean, if you've seen what is arriving in patients' rooms on their tray to eat every day, you are not going to repair your body eating white bread and Jell-O. It's just not a thing. So I host a vegan cleanse every year, and I don't think people talk enough about, because you're saying, okay, well, we're subsidizing these 5 crops. We've got all this genetically modified corn. It's inedible out of the field. It can only become processed. And part of the reason that we're growing so much dang corn is to fuel our insatiable cravings in America for meat. And that, I think, is also part of the cycle. So how do you encourage people to shift their perspective on what their plate should look like each day?
And that's a really delicate ask. And I grew up in Texas, so I ate meat with every meal and every snack.
Yeah.
And if somebody had proposed to me that I modify that, I would have thought, like, A, don't tell me what to eat. B, who are you to tell me what to eat? And I really kind of had to think about how, like, food is so much more than food. It is family, it is memories, it is occasions, it is celebrations, it's Christmas, it's, Easter, it's all these things. And so it's cultural. There's so many components to it. And then it's also really emotional, and we have emotional connections to certain foods. Sometimes we feed our emotions with certain foods. And so really for me, it's not about telling anybody what to do or what to eat, but really sharing the information. And I think for me, as I was learning about genetically engineered crops and the way that it was grown and fed to livestock, at the same time that I was learning about how 80% of the antibiotics that we use are used on the animals we eat, I thought, I don't want to be feeding my own children these genetically engineered crops treated with these pesticides and Roundup. Do I want to be feeding my children meat that has been fed that same stuff? And then on top of that, what is the exposure? And there's plenty of science that'll go back and forth, and it'll be he said, she said. The industry will fund science. It's like, it's safe, it's safe, it's safe. Non-industry funded science will say it's not safe. And guess what? We've seen this before. This was the tobacco industry. The tobacco industry for 50 years told us cigarettes were safe, while independent science was saying something else. So there forever is going to be the raging he said, she said scientific debate. To me, it gets back to transparency and choice. And if you knew that this was how your food was grown, and if you knew that this is how your meat and the animal was treated, would you choose to put this on your plate for family? And so, again, it's why we're seeing this move towards regenerative ranching and sustainable meat. And again, for me, I think it felt really radical to not have meat. I was raised during the zone diet era where everything was protein, protein, protein. Thankfully, I have a great friend from high school. He's a football player and he went on to become an MD, and he's an obesity surgeon, and he wrote a book called Proteinaholic. And so he came at it from full-blown medical perspective. And, one of the points that he makes in his book is that how, as a doctor in medical school, he only had an hour of food and nutrition, and it was really more focused on obesity than anything else. And so we're starting to really have these bigger conversations. The funding behind any of these platforms is always really incredibly important. I had the honor of meeting Susie Cameron the other day. She did the film Game Changers. Again, there's always going to be he said, she said. And I think it's really sort of step back and say, what does moderation look like? What am I willing to try as a consumer? Is it Meatless Monday? Is it one meal a week that I don't want to have meat? Can I do that? Am I going to move towards a meat that is grass fed and maybe more sustainably raised? So again, there are a lot of choices, but I think we have to have transparency into the way that our food is produced to understand why we need those choices.
Absolutely. It's like Michael Pollan said, it's no longer you are what you eat. It's you are what you eat eats. And so if you're eating cow that has been fed this diet that is intentionally engineered to make them fat and big as quickly as possible, it only stands to reason that making those choices would also make us fat and big as quickly as possible. And I completely agree with you. Healthcare makes money. in this country. And so there is no real good drive to keep people well. There is the drive to keep people just sick enough. And that, I think, is just a shame, and it is something that we need to be discussing more often. Robyn O'Brien, it has been an honor to talk to you, and it was a fascinating discussion. I encourage everyone to go and check out The Unhealthy Truth, One Mother's Shocking Investigation into the Dangers of America's Food Supply and What Every Family Can Do to Protect Itself. Robyn, thanks so much for being on the Lindsey Elmore Show.
Thanks for having me. It's great to see you.
The Lindsey Elmore Show is dedicated to helping women live their healthiest lives. And one of the ways that we can do that is by intentionally detoxifying our system from all the crappy food that we eat and all the crappy drinks that we drink. I developed the Clean Slate Cleanse with one thing in mind: make the food delicious. A lot of people, when you tell them, we're going to go wheat-free, sugar-free, alcohol-free, caffeine-free, and vegan, it sounds completely impossible. People tell me they have no idea what they'll eat. People tell me that they are scared that they will be hungry, that they will be restricted. And so I thought, how do I develop healthy recipes that help people to transform the way that they eat and the way that they relate to the food on their plate? Just because it's vegan, just because it's gluten-free, does not mean that it doesn't get to be tasty. When you participate in the Clean Slate Cleanse or purchase a cookbook, you will be purchasing a set of recipes guaranteed to be absolutely delicious, easy to cook, and they will be meals that the whole family will love. Head over to www.cleanslatecleanse.com. Pick up a cookbook, pick up a workbook, and sign up for our next Clean Slate Cleanse. It's 21 days. It will make you feel better, and you will love the food. I promise. And now, back to the show. You may know I host every year a Clean Slate Cleanse where I encourage people to go plant-based for 3 weeks. And I know that may seem crazy to you, and you may think, oh my gosh, I could never just eat plants for an entire 3 weeks. It actually is way easier than you would ever think. And one of the reasons that I encourage people to go plant-based is not only because I believe in the health benefits of eating primarily plants, but also because it is extremely beneficial for the environment. So going plant-based is not only good for your body, it's also way better for our earth. People who have a vegan diet use significantly less water and less land and generate less carbon dioxide than our omnivorous counterparts. Many people work really hard to turn off lights, to ride a bike to work, or turn off tap water to save energy and water, but it's less common to consider the environmental impact of everything that we put into our body. The water consumption alone is astonishing. 1/3 of a pound hamburger requires 660 gallons of water, whereas one apple requires 18 gallons of water. One orange, 13 gallons. 1 pound of chicken requires 468 gallons of water versus 216 for a single pound of soybeans. Pound of pork, 576 gallons of water versus 119 gallons for 1 pound of potatoes. A pound of chocolate requires 3,170 gallons of water versus 449 gallons for a pound of rice. Think about coffee. You know, in the Clean Slate Cleanse, we're also avoiding caffeine, as well as things like chocolate that have sugar and also contain ingredients like theobromine that engage our caffeine receptors. 1 gallon of coffee requires 880 gallons of water to bring to the market. In fact, if every person in the world drank 1 cup of coffee per day, it would require 32 trillion gallons of water to get that caffeine fix. Consumption of meat and animal products also increases the risk to environmental toxins, and these environmental toxins are known to bioaccumulate. For example, a persistent environmental pollutant such as dioxin may have a low concentration in grass secondary to water runoff, but when a cow eats that grass, it concentrates the toxin within the fat tissues as well as in the meat and in the breast milk. If a human then eats the meat or drinks the cow's milk, the toxin is then even further concentrated in human tissues and, when applicable, in human breast milk. Then, if a baby is breastfed, the baby will be taking in a very heavily toxic meal. Dioxins are known endocrine disruptors, and they are a pervasive environmental toxin. The EPA estimates that up to 30% of an adult's overall dioxin exposure is due to the consumption of dairy products. And that number is even higher in children. So 30% of adults who are exposed to dioxins is because of dairy. 50% of children. The ingestion of high-fat dairy brings with it a cocktail of dioxins, polychlorinated bisphenols, and polyfluorinated chemicals, which may result in reduced semen quality in men. Of particular concern for the concentration of environmental toxins is the consumption of seafood. Seafood has been shown to be frequently contaminated with heavy metals, pollutants, pathogens, and marine toxins. One of these pathogens can be mitigated by cooking properly and handling and storage of the product, but the consumption of the pollutants cannot be mitigated by proper cooking techniques. The most concerning heavy metal in fish is mercury. Mercury is released in the environment by plants and as a byproduct of human activity. It is converted to methylmercury by aquatic organisms. Methylmercury accumulates up the food chain, and this means that as you eat increasingly large and carnivorous fish, the higher the likelihood that you will be consuming fish contaminated with mercury. The first documented mercury poisoning due to fish consumption was in the late 1950s in Japan, and mercury toxicity has also been associated with the consumption of wheat seeds coated in mercury-based fungicides. While adults may only be mildly to moderately impacted, women who were pregnant at the time of their poisonings with mercury gave birth to children with severe neurological defects, including speech, language, and attention problems. This has led to stronger warnings against the consumption of fishes during pregnancy and young childhood, especially large carnivorous fish such as shark, swordfish, kingfish, and tilefish. Mercury is not the only concerning ingredient on the seafood menu. Known carcinogens such as dioxins are present in seafood, and all of these bioaccumulate up the food chain. Even if they don't lead to cancer, polychlorinated bisphenols and dioxin cause hormonal changes, changes in fetal development, and reproductive toxicity in adults. So, you can do something. Everybody wants to know what we can do to make our world a better place. I think it starts on our plate. Try just one plant-based meal and check out my food blog, www.cleanslatecleanse.com, for lots of inspirational recipes that can help you get started eating more plants. The 4th of July is right around the corner, and you might think that this is a time when you could definitely not go meatless. But nowadays, there are some amazing plant-based options that can bring those wonderful food memories that we associate with the 4th of July to life without having the harm that happens to the environment and to our bodies when we consume meat. First up, you're going to need a salad. Head over to my blog and grab a recipe for Asian Rotini pasta salad. It's so flavorful and so zesty, and it really complements a wide variety of dishes. It would not be the 4th of July without burgers. So there are a couple of different burgers that I love. I'm a huge fan of Beyond Burger, but for those of you who don't want to eat any processed food, check out my recipe over on cleanslatecleanse.com for vegan mushroom lentil burgers. This is a recipe that I have been cooking for over 10 years, and it took a lot of trial and error, but Now they're satisfying and meaty and tough enough to hang on the grill. Next up, what goes better with burgers than fries? I experimented and played around and found the crispiest way to make fries. So if you like your fries like I like them, which is thin cut and crispy, head to my blog and check out all of the recipes that I have for fries. Next up, you're gonna want some ice cream. In most places in the world, it is hot outside on the 4th of July. So check out my recipes for vegan strawberry ice cream. Make it ahead of time and be sure that it has plenty of time to harden in the freezer. Don't forget your drinks. Spiked lavender lemonade or unspiked lavender lemonade is always an option for you. You can always play games too. Be sure that you're keeping it fun at the 4th of July celebration. So if you're ready to celebrate a 4th of July with an entirely plant-based menu, head to cleanslatekcleanse.com/vegan-4th, that's the number 4 and a TH, -of-July-menu. Clean Slate Cleanse Vegan 4th of July menu is there to help you make food choices every day that create a better environment for all of us. The Lindsey Elmore Show is written and produced by me, Lindsey Elmore. Show segments are produced by Sue Procco and Kelsey Lorman. Production design, sound design, and editing is by Jive Media. If you have a question about this or any other episode of the podcast, send us an email to hello@lindseyelmoreshow.com. And hey, since you're still here, take a moment to subscribe, rate, and review this podcast. And while you're at it, go over and follow us on Instagram @Lindsey Elmore Show. This helps us bring the pod to more people.